James Hankins, welcome to Dad Saves America.
It's a great pleasure to join you.
You left Harvard. As a longtime historian, you're a 40-year historian, been teaching there for decades and decades. America's oldest university, arguably most prestigious, certainly. It's certainly the most prestigious. Whether it's deserved today is arguable. Why did you leave?
Well, I actually decided to leave 5 years ago, right after 2020, and the whole uproar about COVID and the uproar about George Floyd and all of the demonstrations and so on. I just decided at that point I wanted out, and I had no thought of taking another job. My idea was I was going to go off to Italy and enjoy myself and live cheaply but well.
It's a good plan.
I was, yeah. But then I got involved with, I had been involved for quite some time with the classical education movement. I got involved with these civic centers that were being founded all over the country. And I was invited to be on the board of the school where I am now, the Hamilton School of Classical and Civic Education. So I was advising them about people to hire and things like that. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I guess it was 3 years ago now, the then head of the Hamilton School said, well, Hankins, maybe you'd like to join us after you retire. At that point, I had just been asked by Roger Kimball at Encounter Books to start this big book project, which we eventually called The Golden Thread, History of the Classical Tradition, that monster next to you.
Yes, this is a book I often don't get the chance to fully read the books of guests, although I wish I did. I'm a very slow reader, but like you could kill a man with this book.
Right.
I can't wait to dig into its contents.
But textbook, yeah, you could do that.
All right, real quick. If you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It lets YouTube know that you want to see more Dad Saves America, and it helps spread the word. So it's one of the best things you can do to support what we're doing. And now, back to the show. You've got COVID and George Floyd stuff going on at Harvard. What exactly was the thing?
Yeah. So then I said, well, I'm working on this book on Western civilization. This is something that I really believe in. And if I go to the Hamilton School, I can do that. We're at the place in the history of the school, it's only 3 or 4 years old, where you can do anything. You know how it is when you found something new. You founded something new, right?
Yeah.
Emergent order, right? So when you're founding something, there's a lot of opportunity to have influence and take things in the direction that you want to go. So my buddy, Alan Gelzo, who I've known since middle school, we're very old friends. We had both been invited to do the Golden Thread book. We formed a plot that we were going to go to Gainesville, Florida, join the Hamilton School, and then start to promote our dream, which is to revive the study of Western Civ. So that's where I ended up here. Sometimes I've read some press about my departure from Harvard. I got a lot of attention on an article that I published. It became really kind of viral, to my surprise.
Yeah, and on Compact Magazine.
They're constantly, so they're constantly saying, I'm this courageous person who is, abandoning Harvard for a little-known school in Florida. So it's not really the story. I'm not exactly courageous, but I'm at the age where I don't really care anymore. I've lost most of my closest relatives, and all the people that I knew at Harvard are either dead or left. So at that point, and I had cancer and all sorts of things. So at a certain point, you don't care anymore. It's not so much courage as lack of cowardice, I guess, at a certain point, or a lack of concern about the consequences, I would say. A lot of people in universities don't speak out. It's not because of they're cowardly. It's because they have students. graduate students, PhD students, and they don't want them to suffer from any backlash against them. So I don't have that anymore. I'm free to say what I want, and devil take the hindmost.
So, what you just said, something that is almost more damning, which is the idea that a professor who sees the institution going in a direction that's not great, being reticent because their students would face retribution for studying under them if they said something reasonable. That's like bank shot cancel culture. It's like, oh, I don't want my brilliant graduate student in history to not be able to work because I say something along the lines of Western civilization is both a real thing and maybe pretty good.
Yeah, I've had that experience. I have to say, I've had very brilliant students in the last few years, and one couldn't get a job. One was going off to Hong Kong, where he's doing very well. And I've been told by my current graduate students, I still have a couple, that the word has gone around among the graduate students, don't study with Hankins, because you don't want that on your CV. You'll be suspected of being sympathetic to conservatives if you have that on your CV. So that was another good reason to leave Harvard, right? If you can't get a graduate student and you're regarded as Typhoid Mary around the department, it's not a very good situation. And things have reversed themselves, though, now, because all of these civic centers are desperate to hire conservative graduate students and PhDs. So they're going to the few identifiable conservatives like me and asking for suggestions. So now I suddenly have former graduate students who have decided I'm a good thing, and they're crafting or recrafting their CVs to look more conservative. And so the wind has shifted a bit, let's say, in my favor.
I think there's a similar thing happening in the entertainment industry, which is where I came out of. And that is that you have this like monoculture of sort of like, it didn't used to be quite so lunatic, actually, but increasingly crazy, single party rule. But the whole business is completely collapsing. And so the only people that have anything interesting going on are like the new startups in like Christian and conservative media. And Hollywood's like number of production days is at the level of like peak pandemic as we sit here. So
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's kind of who knows? These things ebb and flow. Let's get into the details though. What exactly was happening at Harvard in the aftermath of 2020 and all of the stuff that went on that you felt like was a last straw?
Well, it was kind of a case of the frog in the boiling water, because Harvard, in my view, started down a wrong path already in the 1990s, because the university was very eager to go global. And everybody was doing this in the 1990s. And globalism was coming in from a couple directions. It was coming in from the Vietnam War generation, who disliked their own country. Hated would be a more correct word. They hated their own country. They had developed this very negative attitude towards America. So they were going global as part of a multicultural agenda. They wanted to dilute patriotism by telling people to study something outside of Western history. And then there were the globalists in the world of capital who wanted to. By the way, I'm very pro-capitalist, so let's get that straight from the beginning.
Yeah, but you'll borrow a little bit of Marx for this purpose. The world of capital. Keep going.
Well, I'm very pro-capitalist and always have been. But there were people who wanted to globalize on an economic level, and they were interested in having a generation that was educated for global citizenship, as the phrase was back then.
Yeah.
So Harvard started to dilute its Western Civ requirements. Actually, was responsible in the 1990s for reinstituting a Western Civ requirement, which turned my name to mud, I can tell you right away. So that was shelved, I think, around 2003, 2004. But what happened when the university decided to globalize is that traditional subjects were started to be zeroed out.
And now a quick word about this video's sponsor, Masa Chips. Now, I have eaten a lot of tortilla chips that claim to be natural, and they either taste like cardboard or aren't so natural after all. When you flip around and look at the ingredients, you see all kinds of horrible stuff, but that's not true of Masa Chips. These things are great, and when you look at the back, well, you don't see that much. No seed oils, no mystery chemicals, just real food you can feel good about putting in your mouth. These actually taste incredible. And I'm not exaggerating. Because they're all natural, with Masa, you could finish off a whole bag and actually feel pretty good after. And I know this because I've done it. These are actually my favorite. The Hatch Chili. These are awesome. The problem is, now that I've opened this, I'm going to sit here and eat the entire bag in one sitting. That's because they really are great. It tastes like real food. And of course, you can find it where real food is sold, like Sprouts Farmers Market, Wegmans, Target, Whole Foods Market, and many more locations. Ready to give Masa a try? Go to masachips.com/dad, D-A-D, and use code DAD for 25% off your first order. One thing to know, because Masa uses real ingredients and makes everything in small batches, certain flavors go out of stock regularly. I just finally got my hands on Hatch Chili again after it's been sold out for a couple weeks. Again, that's masachips.com/dad and use code DAD for 25% off. Or click the link in the video description or scan the QR code.
So Harvard, for example, had a very famous course in Dante that had been run by generations, going back into the 19th century, of professors of Italian. They always taught Dante. Of course, you're going to teach Dante if you're in an Italian department. So at a certain point, they stopped teaching Dante. Right? They eventually hired someone a few years back, but for a period of 10 years, there was no dentista, right, on the faculty. There was one who was sent off to run a villa in Italy, but basically there was this gigantic hole in I think, one of the essential texts of Western civilization. And then the history department stopped teaching American History Survey. How can you have a university that doesn't have an American History Survey? But that wasn't important, right? We had to do other things. So even in the fields that were Western, that had Europeanists who were still teaching, the older generation, they were starting to globalize their courses. I did this myself in the early 2000s. I had a course called Care of the Soul, where we studied ancient philosophy, ancient Christianity together. And I decided, well, it would be interesting to compare Care of the Soul, moral self-cultivation in different traditions. So I brought in the Chinese tradition and the Islamic tradition and Buddhist tradition, and it was very interesting. But what happened over time was that the Western subjects were really kind of hollowed out. So if you studied French history, you would study French Empire, but not the French Revolution or medieval France. And if you studied British history, you would study British Empire, but not the British Civil Wars, the British Revolution, parliaments, Magna Carta, all that stuff is out the window. And as the water started to boil, this particular frog realized that the water was boiling intentionally to make people like me jump out of it. And eventually, I think the last person I could really talk to in the department died in 2015. The people who were willing to defend European history were less willing to do so. In the period leading up to the George Floyd exploits, we had the We had the Me Too movement. We had the growth of DEI. We had, are you familiar with what's called the Dear Colleague letter that the Obama administration put out, I believe, in 2013?
Yeah, I remember vaguely that this was the sort of, it's part of this sort of strange dance that the federal government does, where they they can avoid saying they compelled institutions that get mass amounts of federal funding by simply saying, well, we just recommend that maybe you set up kangaroo courts to harass your students and violate the rule of law at the most basic level. We're just suggesting it. But we also have all your money, so just am I getting that about right?
That's about right. Yeah, we're just suggesting it, but you can expect a lawsuit if you don't do what we tell you to do.
Right.
So
we're just suggesting it.
This,
here's the trial lobby who's not suggesting anything and is like holding weapons right behind me.
yeah, exactly. So in response to this, they hired 60 Title IX coordinators whose job was to protect the women at Harvard from being, because at that time you might remember that there were these somewhat somewhat ridiculous estimates that women in the Ivy League schools were being raped at huge levels, 20, 30, 40%. Which is basically worse than the Red Army invading Berlin in 1945, right? So if they really had all these people who were experiencing sexual violence, they should have brought in the National Guard. They shouldn't have brought in 60 Title IX coordinators. So anyway, that was going on. The DEI apparatus was being built up. Eventually, and this is completely a fiction, as I'm sure you know. But I think the FBI statistics for sexual violence on American campuses is under 1%. And when I was on the faculty council in the 1990s, we got a report every year about how much sexual violence there was or charges of it. And it was 3 or 4 cases a year. So bringing in 60 Title IX coordinators with staff meant that you're essentially creating an apparatus to do nothing but to enforce ideological purity. So that also changed the way I thought about Harvard. I was tremendously proud of going to Harvard when I first got there. I liked the place. I liked the way it was run. I liked my colleagues. I admired my colleagues, who were very distinguished people. I was very grateful to the school when I got tenure. But over time, my attitude to it has really changed. I kind of mourn for the Harvard that I knew in the 1980s and 90s when I got there. So I feel happy to be leaving, frankly. I'm sitting here in the sunshine in Florida and looking forward to teaching very bright and engaged students. So I feel that I've gone up in the world, frankly.
I want to spend most of our time digging into the actual ideas that have become utterly forgotten in places like Harvard. But I do think it's always worth coming back to what's happened to these institutions, because it's something that our society needs to understand, that these institutions were functionally taken over, it seems like. And they were taken over by things that amount to just mass lying. It seems to me like it's just building entire staffs, like you said, okay, like a lie being, there's just a massive rape culture, and so we need to build a gigantic multi-million-dollar bureaucracy, when that's not true. So that's a lie. Basically, it is to like enrich a bureaucracy that also gets to be shock troops for other stuff. But there's all these other lies, like the notion that Western civilization itself is somehow worse than all of the other civilizations in history, such that we shouldn't even study it. And if you don't study it, then how do you even know? How do you even know if it's worse or not? Like the whole thing just doesn't make sense to me. Like, how does it pass muster? Did everyone sane just go like, Harvard's the oldest university in the country? Like, where did all the adults go?
Well, Harvard at that time was considered more conservative about Western Civ. It was at Berkeley that the whole anti-Western civ movement got started in '88. But you're speaking of lies. It began with a gigantic lie. And the lie was that Western civilization was a fiction created in the 20th century by American educationalists who wanted to send boys off to war with their hearts beating for the West, right? That there was a story, I forget the name of the man who published this book. It's been completely exploded by Stanley Kurtz, who wrote an expose of it. He's a member of the National Association of Scholars. So I don't really actually want people to remember his name. But nevertheless, it was very widely read at the time. And the 60s generation, the Vietnam generation, was disposed to believe this lie that Western civ was somehow made up for the purpose of encouraging militarism, right? So this is just nonsense. And it's in fact the case that ever since history education became a separate subject in the 16th century, people have taught the Western tradition. They may not have called it Western. They called it something else up until the mid-19th century, but they were teaching the Western tradition. So if you learned history, studied history in the late Renaissance, you're studying Greeks, Romans, medieval Christians, Renaissance. And if you're studying history in the 17th century, the 18th century, if you're in an American college in the 18th century, you're studying Greeks, Romans, medieval Christians, early Christianity, Renaissance, or one of the national histories after that. So the curriculum has actually been remarkably consistent over the entire modern period. We have always taught Western civilization. The term Western civilization goes back actually to the mid-19th century. But because if you're in Europe, of course, you're teaching European history, and you begin with the antiquity, of course. So the most popular textbook in American colleges in the 19th century was a work by the French liberal historian named François Guizot, it's pronounced. And that starts with Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, and European history. It's exactly the same thing that has always been taught to young people in Europe and America for their entire history. So when this big lie was told, for some reason, no one called them on it, or I really don't understand. I was just still in graduate school. No, I was in my early years at Harvard when this thing got started. But it was just astonishing that people accepted this lie. And the other lie that was told at the same time is completely inconsistent, is that there is no such thing as Western civilization. Right?
Wait, there's no such thing as it. So it's both evil and a force of imperialism and destruction, and also doesn't exist at all, actually.
Yes, that was the position that was being taken. So in addition to lies, we can also add to the mix paralogism, lack of logic, basic incapacity to see that two positions are irreconcilable. So anyway, people were aware of this at the time on the conservative side and calling it out, but it was used as an excuse to zero out Western topics. Actually, I was happier when it was still being taught. It went through two phases, right? The first phase was that we're going to teach Western civ, but we're going to expose its evils.
Okay.
Right. So if you're going to teach, ancient history, you're going to teach about slavery. If you're going to teach American history, you're going to teach about colonialism or sexism or something like that. And there was always a critical line on things. And there was even the people who are not openly criticizing the Western tradition, they were in a frame which called for America to be cut down to size. So a fair amount of people would say, yes, they had slavery in other places, but look how bad our slavery was. And there was an obsession with the whole subject of slavery, which to me is a distortion of American history to start off with. So that was going on. And eventually, though, I think it was really in the last 10, 15 years, people started saying, don't teach Western Civ at all, because our poor little children will be tainted by it. Their minds will be tempted to admire something in our past. We have to always keep people focused on the future, right? We have to keep people focused on that utopian future that we're building through the proliferation of government programs and whatnot. But don't look back, right? Don't look back. Or if you look back in anger. That's what the American historical profession was saying from basically 1990 to the present.
So you and I think broadly have, similar worldviews, and it's easy for us to gang up on all this nonsense and call it nonsense for that matter. As we start to dig into the particulars, what is the best case you could make for the people who wanted change in that long history of learning the Greeks, the Romans, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, etc.? We have this tension that goes back, as I understand it, in our country, back to, right back to even the founders. The founders themselves had these, some were more utopian and some were more traditional. Thomas Paine perhaps being more utopian and John Adams being more traditional. These strains, right? Radical change, right from the past, preserve what's good, don't tear up Chesterton's defense. And there's health in that. So what's the positive case you could make for the people that we're both broadly disgusted by in the main?
Yeah. Well, what I hear all the time, the immediate response when I go around the country advocating the revival of Western Civ, the first thing it's said is, what's wrong with global history? Why would you want students to only learn Western civilization when they can learn the world, right? We should learn all civilizations. All civilizations are created equal, according to some people. All cultures are equal. It doesn't matter whether you have bones through your nose or headphones on your ears. Everyone's equal. All civilizations are morally equal. It's a very radical egalitarian idea. So why wouldn't you want to learn about the rest of the world? Don't we need to be global citizens? We have international companies, NGOs. These people need to learn all of that. So I think that's the most difficult argument to answer, but also I think one that's very important to answer. So I'm currently involved in trying to write an article about the teaching of global history. The fact is that you can't teach the whole of history, especially when you're starting in the 6th grade, right? So I have nephews in the teach in public schools, and one nephew teaches in a private Christian school. And I hear about what goes on in these classes. So in 6th grade, they're teaching global history, or 7th grade or 8th grade. And so what do? Well, they start off with Tibetan weaving, right? And then the next day they will show some Indian textiles. And then the next day it'll be the Roman toga. And the next day it'll be the barbarians wearing trousers and female costume. And so they get a kind of mishmash of different costumes around the world. But what they're not learning are the narratives. They're not learning any kind of narrative history, because when you do frame by frame, when you have a kind of polyptic approach to history where you do a different culture every week, or maybe every day, or maybe on the same day, students doesn't really stick in their minds. It's a lot of information being thrown at them, and they maybe memorize it for an exam. But it's not the kind of story that young people need to inspire them and to make them feel at home in the world that they live in. Because the fact is that we are Western. We have a Western system of government that's the fruit of a very long tradition going back to the Greeks and the Romans, but also includes the Middle Ages, medieval republics, and Dutch Republic and the English Republic, if we talk about the Republican form of government. You can't really understand in the broader story of history without knowing Western history. So all those great stories that we need to learn are cut out by this globalization. So students need to understand, for example, why it is we have freedom of religion. Why do we have freedom of speech? There were struggles for those things. There were battles over them. People died for it. And people need to have some kind of sense of what our story is, not just as Americans, but as Americans as part of Western civilization. If they don't learn that, they're going to be, they won't understand the world they're living in. They won't understand, for example, the religion of most of the people around them. And they won't, they don't have any heroes and philosophers and statesmen in the future, right? This is always the line of the progressives, that we're going to build a better society, but we're not going to look at the successful societies behind us. We're not going to study, especially, what's especially bad about this approach is you don't study why things succeeded and why things failed, because that's the whole point of historical study, or always has been, from the time of Herodotus in the 5th century BC, that history was written to instruct citizens and statesmen about what worked well in the past, what worked badly, what seemed to be a good idea at the time and turned out not to be a good idea at the time. So the whole process of teaching practical wisdom on the political level and the personal level, all of that is just abandoned for this kind of smorgasbord approach to the study of history. And I think it's not successful. So that's I think where if I were trying to find an argument against what I'm saying, that's where I would go to the people who say we have to do world history, that Western history is too exclusive.
Yeah, I mean, the practical concern of you only have so much time in a school, in an experience as a teacher, and doing this sort of like cursory survey of a bunch of stuff that's like mildly interesting, but basically feels like you're walking through a museum and you were forced to attend. Yeah, that's pretty boring. And you're not. So the flip side, the one question I have is, you talk about a narrative. I mean, I think our brain, there's a lot of reasons to believe that we only really get to remember things if they're in story form.
Exactly.
Just maybe that's about evolution, going back to the campfire. There's something about it inherently. I don't know. But help me just for a second and help the viewer understand how should good history, as you see it, make use of narrative? Because I think the challenge with narrative is it goes A, then B, then C, and that suggests causation. But history is very complex, and there's a lot of moving parts, and what caused what is not necessarily even fully knowable looking back. The further you look back, the harder I imagine it is. So help me understand what good history is supposed to be from your perspective.
Just linking up with our last point, if you want to understand and sympathize with someone, you ask them their story. And sometimes you will be repelled by their story, but most often you will gain in sympathy for them when you hear what they went through, why they're at where they are now. So if we just want to understand how we got to the point where we are, we need to know the story. Now, stories, I don't know if you've ever seen this wonderful podcast called The Rest is History with Tom Holland. That's fantastic. If anyone doubts that the telling of history can be absolutely fascinating, I would advise them to look at this. But if you hear real historians talking about the narrative of history, it's very exciting, actually, because especially if you're like me and you don't always remember what the details of samurai history are. I was listening to samurai history today on Holland. And if you don't know quite what the outcome is, it can be very exciting. It's like watching a movie without a spoiler, right, in your head. So, but it's very interesting, even when you know what the outcome is, to understand how it happened, right? How did the Roman Empire fall?
Yeah.
How did the Roman Republic fall? That is, for example, a story which has been told time and time again. Right. I once had a research project under me as a senior at Harvard who proved to me that all but 2 U.S. presidents at one point in their political lives had been accused of being Caesar, right? The man who brought down the Roman Republic.
All but 2.
All but 2. Well, George Washington escaped that charge, and I think the other, I forget who the other, it's one of the more obscure American presidents. But in any case, Millard Fillmore or something like that. But in any case, it's part of our story. And if you look around the U.S. Capitol, you'll see the places, filled with dignified classical buildings. So why do we think that classical architecture is dignified and suitable to public buildings? Well, because of the Romans and the history of architecture. You can't understand anything about the world you live in if you don't know these histories. And they all have stories attached to them, and that's how we remember them. I tell the story of Gothic architecture, for example, in the second part of my book. And there is a story there. There's a story that has to do with the founder of Gothic architecture, whose name was Abbot Suger, and how he came to develop a new form of architecture that emphasized stories and light. So, if you have that story and you could connect the building with the story, and it's a remarkable story, really. They built hundreds of cathedrals within 100 years of the invention of the Gothic cathedral. Everybody wanted to have one. Every city in Europe of any size wanted to have a cathedral. They all were building these Gothic buildings competitively against the other cities. And Masons, this is the origin of the Freemasons, right? The Masons are going around spreading the knowledge of how to build a Gothic building because it's actually pretty advanced statics and dynamics to build one of these places. So I think the stories help to fix something in place and also discuss the function, right? So why did the Gothic architecture get built? Well, because the church was trying to evangelize this urban population. It wanted to have a gigantic monument in the center of the city, which people would go to, and they could learn the stories from stained glass windows, or in Italy they learned them from frescoes, but they were teaching tools. They were meant to be spiritual centers, a place where people could go and silence the world of the city outside them to have a kind of monastic experience in the middle of the city. City churches were not really built before the Gothic movement. The biggest buildings were monasteries in the early Middle Ages. So it's really a remarkable story. And I think that if you have that in your education somewhere, you understand your world because you see the classical building, you see the Gothic building, you see the Baroque building, which is in some ways an outgrowth of the classical, and you can make sense of your surroundings in historical term. You get what I call historian's X-ray vision. Mm-hmm. This is my favorite term. So, if you go to the city of Rome, for example, and you have no education whatsoever, it's just what William James called a bloomin' buzzin' confusion, right? There's some people whirring around you on motorcycles and cars and buses, and you see these old buildings that are falling down that turn out to be ancient Rome, and you have no idea what's going on. But if you are a historian, if you're not necessarily a historian, but if you've had a decent education, you start to see layers, right? You see the strata. You can see pre-Roman Rome, Etruscan Rome. Well, they haven't any Etruscan Rome, but pre-Roman Rome. You can see a Greek part of Rome. You can see the Roman part of Rome. You can then see the fall of the Roman Empire. You can see the medieval ages and the buildings that are associated with that, and how the whole city kind of changed on its axis because of the ruins, how the ruins were despoiled of all their marble to build medieval palaces. You can build up this the sense of history, the sense of the city, by having historians' X-ray vision. And I think that's immensely valuable to people in general, because history is the antidote for fanaticism. Right? History is what makes conservatives. I'm reading some stories lately about conservative historiography, and there's a connection between the study of history and conservatism. Just because people who know history are not going to be stampeded into some radical movement if they have some counterweight in their mind against it. My favorite example is COVID, right? Because COVID, when it broke out, people were running around like chickens with their head cut off.
Right.
They had no idea what was going to happen. Well, I don't have to rehearse that whole story. But eventually it turned out that 1/3 of 1% of the population died from COVID, which was terrible to have COVID deaths, slightly higher than other pneumatic diseases. But if you're a historian, you know that something like 40% of the population of the Mediterranean died of plague in the 6th century AD, and a similar number in the 14th century AD, so that there was no call to be stampeded the way we were, and our civil rights taken completely away from us by these dictatorial regimes that were put in the time of COVID. But I think if people had had more historical sense, they would have been more resistant to this. We would have been asking more questions.
I mean, you don't even have to go that far back, right? Because all you have to do is go back to the fact that during Woodstock in like the late 60s, there was what was it, the Hong Kong flu? There was an Asian flu that was ripping through the society and killed like 500,000 people. And Woodstock was taking place against that backdrop with everybody covered in mud and on top of each other in all kinds of ways. So there's this phrase, right? You know, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. How true do you know? How much of a truth for truism is that phrase for you as a historian?
Well, not much, frankly. I think that people that human actions do fall into certain patterns. I think that people who are ignorant of history will make the same mistakes. But that's, one of the reasons why you study history, not to make the same mistakes. History does not have, I'm a believer in human free will, right? So I don't think that there's inevitable patterns and I think very few historians believe that there are kind of mechanical patterns of cyclical history that we're all going to go through all the time. Plato has this view in the Republic. There's a regular cycle of constitutional change, but it doesn't stand up to even Greek historical information. So I'm very critical of this idea that there's going to be a necessary pattern in history. I don't think that history is a scientific discipline. It's it's an art that makes use of sciences. So people who believe that are making a claim to knowledge that is impossible. Machiavelli, in a way, tries to do this. He has overconfidence in his own ability to predict the future. I once went through the works of Machiavelli looking for all the predictions that he made, and none of them came true, right? And he's talking. This will give you an example of Machiavelli's ability to predict the future. He's talking in The Prince, and he says that ecclesiastical principalities, because they are ruled by priests and people believe religion, they are completely stable and can never be undermined. He's thinking of the papacy. So he says this in around 1516. In 1517, the Reformation breaks out, right? And he doesn't appear to notice. I've read through I've read through a lot of the correspondence of Machiavelli. He doesn't seem to know that there's a reformation going on in Germany, which is deposing hundreds of ecclesiastical princes all over Germany and the rest of Europe. So, I mean, and he's predicting that, Florence will always be a republic when he's writing to the Medici. This is right before the Medici take over Florence and then proceed to rule it for 300 years. Yeah, so he's a terrible prophet. But
he was like the Paul Ehrlich of his day, basically.
Yeah, he's the Paul
just decrying things that are instantly disproven.
And that's what they get paid the big bucks for, I guess, the ability to slough off their mistakes like that. Anyway, so I don't really think that history repeats itself. It's sometimes said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that's correct, that we find similar situations. And that, frankly, is why history is valuable, because there are similar situations. And there's also a sense that many more possibilities are out there than the average person is willing to entertain. So it's sometimes said that the only historical event that international relations theorists are aware of are 1938 and Munich, right?
Right.
I'm exaggerating somewhat, but you understand that 1938 and Churchill and Chamberlain and Hitler, that comes up constantly. And because it's a familiar episode, but there's so much more possibility out there in all of history. So when you learn more about what has happened in the past and all the different ways that things can turn out, you have much more practical wisdom, much more prudence, as the old term is. You have a sense of how many ways things can go wrong. So, the progressives are always saying, we know what's going to happen next. Here's our program. Just give us money and everyone will be happy. And conservatives are always saying, haven't we tried that? Didn't we try that in the 1960s? Don't we have programs that already do that on the books? But, so history. I really think that history and conservatism are very closely allied. And it's a kind of a mystery to me how so much of the history profession has gone so far to the left, despite the, I think, natural tendency of people with historical knowledge to be conservative. Now, I'm maybe self-refuting myself here, but because there are so many historians that are on the left today. But that wasn't the case when I first got to Harvard. I have to say that we had a generation of people who had fought in the Second World War. They knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the West. They weren't just fighting for America. And so it's very hard for me to understand why so many historians are on the left. But of course, they approach history in a different way. They're much more approaching from the point of view of social science and much less interested in the stories of history and in the remembered past, right? So in the Golden Thread book that Alan Gelso and I wrote together, we call it a history of the Western tradition, not a history of Western civilization. And what we're trying to emphasize is that it's a history of the remembered past. It's the history of the way people remembered the Greeks and the Romans and the Middle Ages and the Christian conquest of the Roman Empire and the medieval papacy and the empire and the rise of nation states and the rise of republics. That has a particular way that it's remembered. And it's a way that is very much involved with the development of practical wisdom, understanding decision-making. That's what history was really written for before the time of Hegel. History was there to inform decision-makers, whether they be citizens or statesmen, but mostly statesmen, that this is something that's happening to you now. We search the pages of history to see something similar. what were the outcomes then? What were the decisions made? Excuse me. And, what are the dangers of taking this course of action? And what have been the most successful courses of action? That's what history was for. And I think we've really impoverished ourselves by not using that as a approach to history anymore.
What is Western civilization? You've alluded to it several times, pointing to essentially this sort of sequence of milestones and moments: the Greeks, the Romans, the Enlightenment, the great books. But is there how should someone that wants to, like, what is this Western tradition when you sort of try to synthesize the telling into a set of principles?
Well, first of all, Alan and I think of the Western tradition as a succession of civilizations. So the civilization of the Greeks was the first of the Western civilizations. It begins essentially in the 8th century BC, and Homer is the first great author. And that civilization was superseded by the Romans in the 2nd century AD, or BC. And then the Romans had their civilization, which absorbed out of the Greeks. That's an important point, that each successive civilization absorbs the previous one and admires the previous one. And then there was the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. And we approach this Christian empire as a different civilization. It starts off being continuous with ancient Rome, and that gradually becomes more and more of a Christian civilization. And then we talk about the origins of modern European civilization, which I take back to the late 11th century. So it's a succession of civilizations, but it's bound together by this thread of tradition, gold thread of tradition, because there was always...
What is that 11th century? Just stop at that. What was the 11th century moment that constitutes the European civilization for you?
Well, this is not my invention. There are many historians who take the same view. In the 10th century, in Western Christendom, in the Latin-speaking part of Christendom, not Byzantium, but the Latin-speaking part, there was a general civilizational collapse in the 10th century. That Western Europe was invaded by Vikings, it was invaded by Arab, Muslim raiders from the south, it was attacked by the Magyars from the east, various barbarian tribes, and it just was collapsing. And they lost any kind of central order in the civilization. But that started to be rebuilt in the late 11th century through the papacy and through the revival of the medieval German Empire. So the High Middle Ages, which is the beginning of European civilization, is it's a new civilization in many ways, and I won't bore your listeners by listing them all, but it's a civilization that draws not only on the Greeks and the Romans, but also on the Germanic peoples, what the ancient Romans would have called the barbarians. So something like parliaments, for example, is really a Germanic contribution to Western civilization. The Germans were, I say Germans to mean pretty much all the successors, Charlemagne and his successors, right? These Germans had a different form of government. Charlemagne, for example, would never make a decision without consulting all the lords in his territories. He used to go around these progresses. So you can say that German monarchy is much more consultative than any previous monarchy. People had the right to be heard and to give counsel. So that eventually grew into the parliamentary system in England in the 13th century. But there are a number of things like this. The Germans also combined, and eventually the Normans most of all, combined the military prowess of the Vikings with the Romans. The Normans, who really dominate the High Middle Ages, are militarily a combination of Viking sea raiding skills and the traditional formation fighting on horseback that the Normans got from the French before them, so you have this very powerful military tradition that's quite different from the Roman tradition ultimately, which takes over Western Europe in the late 11th, 12th century. And that is what is launched against the Muslims in the Crusade, and so forth. So there's one of the ways you can divide up civilizations is by the type of military system that they have. And the Europeans invented a new one. So I mentioned parliaments, I mentioned military systems. There's also different social systems, which you can talk about. The patriarchal family is much more important for the Europeans. I know you're very interested in the family, so I was offering you some bait to ask me questions. But just get back to the main point, which you asked about, is a civilization is either, you can look at a civilization as a treasury of achievement, right? As great works of art, great political systems, inspiring philosophy, literature, the arts, you name it, as a set of resources in the past that can be learned about, reused, and can continue the tradition and can make new and original contributions to the tradition. So if you're an artist, you can measure yourself against previous artists. But it can also be thought of, and this is really what I think is important right now, is that a civilization is something that civilizes, right? So that if you want civilized generations to follow us, they have to study our civilization. If you study half a dozen different civilizations on an equal basis and have no particular admiration or knowledge of your own, that type of continuity is going to be very hard. So we call our story the golden thread because these civilizations have been tied together over 3,000 years by sometimes very tenuous threads. Can I give you an example of this?
We'll give the example, and then I want to ask about. I have a question I'll try to remember. But yeah, give me an example of this thread.
So, the basis of modern legal traditions is Roman civil law. It was revived in the 12th century, and it became the basis of legal education. So even today, in some universities, you can study Roman jurisprudence as examples of how legal problems are solved, how the Romans solved their problems, how they negotiated the statute, the actual case, the needs of the common good. There were brilliant examples of jurisprudential decisions taken, and they were reduced to a single book, which is called the Digest of Legal Opinions. It was created under the authority of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. So in the 11th century, there is one manuscript of this in the entire world. So the basis of modern European jurisprudence is reduced to a single manuscript. And the works of Aristotle, right? Aristotle's works, his technical works, which is what we have today, his works on ethics and biology and politics and physics and all those works were down to a single box of scrolls in the 1st century BC. We almost lost, and Aristotle, if you know anything about the history of Western education, he's the backbone of Western education from the 12th century to the 17th century. When the scientific revolution happens, it's revolting against Aristotle, but Aristotle's still being taught. I teach Aristotle's ethics and politics still today, and they're unsurpassed. But it was a single box of manuscripts. It just makes my sort of heart beat with fear when I read the story. So there are lots of cases like that, and we almost lost Latin literature in the 7th century AD when after the Muslim invasions. There are people
Now,
such as my
what
dear
exactly
wife.
was that? Was it just because the Muslim conquerors were burning books? Like what was the nature of the potential losses?
Well, the Muslim conquest started in the 7th century. They took away 2/3 of the Roman Empire, the Middle East, Egypt, North Africa. They were taking over most of Spain until it was reconquered. And the West became the Reconquista, yeah. So the West became extremely poor. They could barely keep things going on an economic level. There was no culture the culture survived in monasteries. And there are a few people copying monasteries, but there are very few copies of any Western work of literature in the 7th century. We have people have cataloged all the surviving manuscripts. In fact, my wife's former employer was the one who cataloged all of these things. So suddenly, in the 8th century, when Charlemagne is advised by Alcuin that he has to refound Latin literature, suddenly we have thousands of manuscripts. So somebody made a decision at some point, it was Charlemagne and his advisor, that we couldn't simply copy the Bible and a few of the church fathers. We had to recover Roman civilization because the Romans had known how to run a civilization. They had law, they had administrative systems, they had just basic grammar and knowledge of how to speak, which was disappearing at the time. This is the period when the Latin language was disappearing and the vernacular language was just getting started. So Charlemagne said, we have to bring back Roman literature, Roman philosophy, and that's when it came back. So that was, again, another moment when things almost died out.
Yeah, it's one of these things that when you think about what got us to where we are today, there's an inevitability that's sort of baked into the fact that we're here, that it feels like it could only have gone this way. And it's kind of terrifying, frankly, to like linger on what the other path would have been if Aristotle was lost, if the monasteries had been sacked and raided and nothing was left.
Were.
I mean,
many of them were.
I know there's some people who are critical, look back on sort of the history of Islam as a conquering force, since all of the Islamic world today was as I understand it, was actually the dominant force of Christendom at the time, the Byzantine Empire, and say that actually that Islamic expansion was responsible, at least in part, for the Dark Ages. It sounds like that's what you're talking about at that moment. Is that right? Is that how you understand what precipitates the Dark Ages?
Well, the Byzantine Empire preserved Greek literature and Greek civilization, which was always more advanced than Latin, and they preserved it against, the Muslims almost conquered Constantinople in 717. That would have been the end of Western civilization, at least humanly speaking. I think divine providence might have something to say about it, but that, humanly speaking, that would be what saved the Greek part of Western civilization. But yes, I mean, the Islamic invasions were a terrible blow to the West, and they impoverished the West. The Byzantines were kind of, what's the city? And they're the Minas Tirith of Christendom at the time. Osgiliath, which is Rome, had been destroyed, but Minas Tirith is still there in Constantinople, preserving the Western tradition. And then we have the men of the West who are keeping things alive in northwestern Europe. But yes, it was a terrible setback for Christian civilization. And but one shouldn't get the idea that the Muslims didn't have their own civilization. They did. Obviously, they built a great civilization. And they used some of the materials from ancient West, right? They used a lot of, they hated the Romans. The Romans were the bugbears of the Muslims, but they recognized that they learned warfare in part from the Romans, in part from the Persians. So they did create a civilization of their own, but it's not for a long time, Muslim civilization was really the enemy of the West. And it's, to me, indicative that when the Islamic threat starts to recede seriously in the 17th century, right, that's when we have liberalism growing up, because the pressure was off. That's what I think, that freedom is something that you can enjoy when you have power and you have peace and you have wealth. But when you're under assault, you have to have a more authoritarian system. That's always the case, right? During World War II, the U.S. presidency became much more authoritarian necessarily. Yep. So when the pressure lifts up in the 17th century and Western Europe can breathe and can enjoy its wealth, enjoy its power, that's when you get liberalism, which is that's a historian's view of liberalism. It's not a political scientist's view, but that's the way I think about liberalism as a luxury good of civilized countries.
Just for the person that hears liberalism and isn't quite sure what you mean by that, define liberalism in your terms here.
Well, I'm thinking of classical liberalism, right? I mean Adam Smith and Locke and authors like that, people who believed in economic freedom, intellectual freedom, and freedom to depart from religious models of gender relations. Okay, so I discovered reading this book that divorce and adoption were extremely rare they were illegal in France as late as the late 19th century, early 20th century. So there are many obviously definitions of liberalism. I'm giving you a little too much, as is my fatal habit. Then there's high liberalism, which is essentially the desire of the state to enforce the desire of the state to take over more private life, let's put it that way. But the type of liberalism that I admire, classical liberalism, wants to place limits on political power. So the first question in any political philosophy is, how much is going to be political, right? So I think my most hated phrase in political philosophy is the personal is political, which was a slogan of the feminist movement in the 80s and 90s. Because this sort of feminism, I'm not condemning feminism entirely, but I'm just saying this sort of feminism. Just well,
most of it deserves what it gets.
Well, the sort of feminism that wants every part of your life to be invaded by ideology. That's to me the opposite of liberalism. Okay, if I want to clarify what I mean by liberalism. But in America, we have this odd vocabulary. No one calls socialism liberalism in other countries, but in America, people don't want to use the term socialism because it doesn't win elections, or at least it hasn't won elections until quite recently.
Yeah.
So they use the term liberalism. It's just a mask. It's a mask of socialism.
Yeah,
current usage.
One of the things I wanted to get your take on, in broad strokes, because we're covering, it's hard to go, we can pick any one particular moment in a conversation like this, but given the golden thread is this, I think we have to stick to some important big themes. And one of them that I've been thinking a lot about, I read a book by Tom Holland called Dominion.
Oh, yeah. Great book.
And I was curious, there's so much in that book that stuck with me. But one of the things he asserts, maybe uniquely, it certainly is this notion that it was actually Christianity and the culture of Christianity and the thinking and the thinkers in early Christianity that gives rise to the notion of the secular life, which I'd never really heard before. But then when you look at other civilizations, Islamic civilization to the present, even Jewish civilization, pre-Christ and pre-fall of Israel and destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the notion of of the society, of the tribe, of the leadership, of the governance. And the religion and the priests, they were all like this. Like you go to the Aztecs and it's like this. You go to, Hinduism and the ancient Indian empires, it's like this. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's actually an accurate assessment of Christianity's contribution to the development of Western liberalism?
Well, I would put it a bit later, frankly. I think that the notion of the secular in late antiquity is really etymologically that which belongs to this age as opposed to the eternal. So the opposite of the secular is the eternal in late antiquity. You have people who are trying to limit, we're trying to adjust the boundaries of Christian authority in the 4th century and 5th century, mostly because they're living in a society that's still maybe majority pagan or 40% pagan. We don't really know. There are all sorts of different opinions. But if you're trying to enforce, you cannot force people who are not of your religion to practice your religion. That's, I think, pretty much an historical impossibility. Emperor Justinian tried to do it in a couple small populations in the 6th century, but he failed miserably. So you have to have some form of toleration, or at least in the Middle Ages, the common thing to do in Islam and Christianity alike was to have second-class citizenship for people who are not of your religion. So if you're a dhimmi, if you're a Christian living in a Muslim world, you pay higher taxes, you have to defer to good Muslims, you can't hold office, you're not supposed to hold office, you have to bow down in the street when you meet a Muslim going by, you have to wear a special costume in some places. If a Muslim walks in, if you go to law with a Muslim, you're going to be under Muslim law, not under your own law. So it's a real disadvantage. The Romans did the same, the Christian Romans did the same thing. So that is not really secularism in my way of thinking. I think the real origins of liberalism come in the Middle Ages, in the late 11th and 12th centuries, when the papacy decides it should dominate Christendom. Right, this is under Gregory VII, the so-called investiture controversy, but it was about who the top dog political power in Christendom was going to be. So I think that what Gregory was up to is he wanted to create a kind of Christian caliphate. He was going to be the head of state, and the secular, what we call secular lay rulers, let's say, of Christendom were going to be under his power. This was a view of things that was not accepted by the Roman Empire, the medieval empire, which started to call itself the Holy Roman Empire in the 1150s, in reaction to the papal claims of superior sanctity. So what ends up being the case is that you have, by the real late 12th, 13th century, you have two parallel governments in Europe. You have church government, which has got its own laws, its own taxation system, its own hierarchy, Pope, bishops, archbishops, bishops, all the way down the hierarchy. And they have their own foreign policy, which is the Crusades. The Crusades are essentially the foreign policy of the Pope. And then you have a completely separate lay hierarchy with the emperor, the king, the dukes and counts and whatever below them. The kings and emperors, well, especially the kings, had their own bureaucracy, their own taxation system, their own military. And you had this very strange situation, which I haven't found anywhere else in any other civilization, of two separate parallel authorities, one the authority over the soul and the other the authority over the body. Okay. So that is the situation against which the Protestant reformers rebelled. And not just the Protestants, but also to some extent Catholic rulers rebelled in the 16th century. So what is liberalism? It's all of the things in life that are controlled by canon law. Roman law is not interested in controlling your daily life, right? Roman law doesn't tell you that you have to, what marriage law is. It doesn't dictate. It doesn't dictate behavior the way that medieval Christian and Islamic law do. It's much more free in a sense because the number of things that it's trying to do, basically trying to ensure the preservation of property. There's very little constitutional law. So when the Christians introduced this canon law in imitation of the Muslims, they are trying to control more aspects of life. They want to cut down as we were saying before, they want to have more of life be political, if you will, or at least controlled by religion. That's the wrong way. Political is the wrong word, but they want to readjust the border between what the state can control and what the private individual controls. So what is liberalism? It's the exact same things that the medieval church controlled through its system. So intellectual freedom, that was strictly regulated by the Roman Church through canon law and theology, right? And if you violated that, you would become a heretic and you would be burned at the stake. Freedom of family law, that one of the main functions of medieval canon law is to control families, conditions for marriage. I shouldn't say control families, but to regulate families, conditions of marriage, conditions of inheritance, who can marry whom. They were much more restrictive than the Romans had been about who can marry whom. So it's been argued that they basically weakened the family economically, forcing people to cooperate more create civil society essentially as a form of cooperation. So that whole area of life that the canon lawyers exercise authority over, that disappears. In some Protestant countries, they bring it back to some extent, but the level of regulation over personal life was very little. And the third big area is the economy, because the medieval church develops a law of economic transactions, inheritance, usury. The medieval church gradually loosens the medieval church I'm not trying to say the medieval church is intolerant of free economic freedom, because that whole concept didn't even exist in the medieval period. But they had biblical prohibitions against usury, and they have, of course, the system of the ancient Torah, which was a kind of distributist economic system. It wasn't free enterprise. There was some controlled by God and his priests over what people could do economically. So that all disappears. There's some laws against usury, but the economic regulation of the church in the Middle Ages is very, I'm trying to avoid using the word invasive because that kind of settles the question. And I'm also Catholic, so I don't want to condemn the medieval church, but I think this was
It's okay. It's okay. I'm Catholic too.
Yeah, okay. So the idea is that the medieval church was very much interested in controlling aspects of life which later were freed up and became aspects of free civilizations, especially intellectual freedom, freedom of the family, which includes sexual freedom, and marriage law, and then economic freedom. There was very elaborate economic regulations, not always observed, mind you, of medieval societies, and they tried to accommodate profit economy. They weren't against profit, but they had to kind of what happens ultimately at the end of the Renaissance period, right before the Reformation, is that they develop a way to tolerate the banking system and lending money in a way that's is compatible with a capitalist economy. That was done under the first pope, to have been also a banker, or Leo X, who was a Medici. His whole family were bankers.
I was going to say, I don't know this history exceedingly well, but there's certain characters that loom large when I think of banking in Italy, and the family of the Medicis was popping into my head as you said that. So to just try to grapple with all of that for a moment, you have this period of time in the in Europe and Italy, in what would become, Italy and France and Germany, and then the United Kingdom eventually. I guess one thing I'm curious about is the sense in which law is enforced, as we experience it today, is the cops come. Like, you do something wrong, and the cops come and put handcuffs on you, and then you're taken to a court. Is that what happened if you have these two parallel systems in this period of sort of like the Middle Ages and the pre-Enlightenment West, when you violate church law, but you're not violating the law of the monarchy, what happens to you? Do like a bunch of friars come and put you in cuffs? Like, how did the church, prior to the Protestant Reformation, and then what would come next, how did the church enforce canon law on the public?
Well, this was done, in the technical phrase, in foro interno, in the internal form, which means the confessional. So the merchant would go into the confessional, and there would be a friar there, probably Franciscan or Dominican, saying, "What did you sin?" And the man would say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I've done usurious things." And then the friar would say, do you know who you injured? And then he would say yes, and then he would be told to make restitution. Or he would say no, and then the friar would say, "Okay, you should give money to the church." Right. So the most famous usurer of the Middle Ages was a man named Scrovegni, who founded the Arena Chapel, famously decorated by Giotto. It's a very beautiful place. Right, so that was an act of restitution because the people that Scrovegni's father had cheated through his usurious practices could not be compensated. So that chapel was built as a compensation for the sins of his father. So there's the confessional. But also the Pope had other ways of getting after you. I mean, Henry VIII is the most famous example that Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce, and other divorces or separations had been managed by other crowned heads and uncrowned heads. They got the sheet of paper from the papacy saying you may now your marriage is annulled, but Henry couldn't get it, and the reason why was that Henry or the Pope at that time was under the influence of the Holy Roman Empire, and Henry was at war with the Holy Roman Empire, so they used that. The Pope could also declare an interdict, meaning that it's a kind of clerical strike, so that all of the clerics in a particular area were not permitted were to give the sacraments. So you couldn't go to Mass, you couldn't have your child baptized if your parents died. They couldn't receive blessing. This is the theory. Of course, people obviously were going to violate that. So the church could stop the sacraments. And then the big one was excommunication. They could declare you to be in violation of the Christian community, you'd be cast out. And that had real teeth also because if you're excommunicated, it's considered perfectly licit to strip you of all of your goods and even your life. Because you became an outlaw basically without the protections of law. So it was not good to be excommunicated, at least in principle. Now, the popes started to use this weapon of excommunication so freely that no one believed in it anymore. So the famous example I remember is they got mad at a couple towns in southern France for not paying their taxes. So they just excommunicated everybody in all those towns that hadn't paid their taxes. So people are walking around saying, well, I guess we're excommunicated. We're all going to go to hell. That means you're going to go to hell. if when you die, unless you seek forgiveness. Right. So these are called the spiritual weapons of the papacy. And eventually they were discredited just by overuse, frankly. I think people were afraid of them. And they first started to be used, I believe, in the 8th century. The Pope started using them against people he didn't like, people who were violators of Christian law in the 8th century. But it really became a kind of instrument of statecraft in the 11th century.
Just to linger on this for a minute, because this period of time that you're describing, where you have this powerful Catholic Church and you have these parallel institutions of the monarchy and nobles and whatnot, and then you also have the church, you have and its hierarchy. It sounds like what you're describing is that it was basically moral persuasion, let's say, or moral suasion is maybe the term. But if I'm a trader, I'm one of these like junior Medicis, and I'm lending money, and it's like I go into confession and I'm like, bless me, Father, I guess I sinned. I charged 10%. The guy had a bad reputation. There was a risk I wouldn't get my money back. I mean, isn't that what interest is for? Like, I'm not sure what I did wrong, but I guess it's a sin. And the priest says, okay, this is terrible, but if you want to make good on this deal, build us a church. Why can't you just say, you know what? How about this, Father? I don't really care. I don't agree with you. I'm just going to keep doing my thing because I think it works. And what happens if you denied it? Was like the culture of being in the good graces of God in the eyes of the church so pervasive that nobody would do that?
That's absolutely it. I mean, Cosimo de' Medici, a very famous case, when Pope Eugene IV was in town, he went to see the Pope and he said, I'm not really sure whether I've committed usury. I might have. So I want to get this off my conscience. What should I do? And the Pope says, rebuild the church of San Marco and decorate it. And he decorates with the famous frescoes of Fra Angelico, which are absolutely gorgeous. But yes, the problem is that, of course, the church has a tremendous amount of moral suasion. The church is also by far the greatest landowner in Europe. They own a third of all the property in Europe. So if you don't do what the papacy says, it's going to be a serious problem for business for you. And the people who you might do business with might not want to do business with you if you are under an excommunication. In fact, they're prohibited in many places from doing business with an excommunicate. They've got a lot of weapons, but it has to be said that the papacy and the religious orders that were in charge of enforcing canon law were very responsive to people's actual needs. It wasn't the case that the economic practices of Europe and the papal doctrine were just completely antithetical to each other. It started that way in the 12th century because the church was basically a monastic church and they didn't like people who owned property. They thought those people were bad. In the 12th century, the canon law from the 12th century, there were people saying you cannot be a merchant and pleasing to God, right? So, but what happens is the church develops a economic doctrine which is much more flexible. So they understand, for example, that things like risk, and there's an usury. If you get paid for any risk you're taking, that's not usury. They decide. Or if you've had an actual loss thanks to lending money to somebody else, that's not usury. And if you're doing some service, like you're providing the medieval equivalent of a traveler's check. I was searching for that term because no one uses traveler's checks anymore.
Yeah.
But
check clearing, moving money between places.
Right, bills of exchange. So that's not usury because you're providing a service. So ultimately, by the time of Leo X, the banker's son, usury comes to be very narrowly defined And it really means someone who has got a lot of money and could help somebody but doesn't. Right. So it's like the man has got lots of food and someone comes knocking on the door, and or he invests. He makes a profit that it's very difficult. In other words, it becomes very difficult to commit usury. If there's no possibility that you could suffer loss, and you still refuse to lend. No, I'm not going to try to say it because I'll say it wrong. But anyway, the major point that I'll try to make is that usury is very narrowly defined, and it's easy for a banker to get around that. So they invent consumer banking in the 15th century, and they have to come up with rules for interest, and they come up with rules saying anything above 8% in this town at this time is usury, but 8% below is not usury. So that's more like modern usury law, right? That usury law today is what, 30% interest or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because this can seem like an arcane subject, usury law. I mean, it obviously can get it gets evoked from time to time today if you're talking about things that have higher interest rates, like high risk loans, payday loans, stuff like that. Like, oh, this is usurious. But I think the reason why, as an econ nerd myself, I find this interesting and important is it's this very deeply biblical, long-standing, across a lot of traditions, discomfort with charging money for delayed gratification, right? Savings and investment. Yeah. And as to the best of my ability to understand what gave rise to modernity, savings and investment played a pretty big role. Like if you're going to start to have machinery that allows automation of things, you have to build the machinery. And while you're building the machinery, it's not earning you a revenue because you're building the machinery and it's not outputting anything. And so you need a way to finance the building of the factory, the building of the assembly line, the building of the machinery, the building of the train and the tracks before you can move the goods and sell them at market. And I'm recounting this because I think most people don't understand the nature of banking or finance or lending and saving. So you have this thing called savings and investment that makes it possible for someone with savings to earn a return for foregoing the use of the savings by giving it to this guy that wants to build a factory or this guy that wants to start a railroad. And the interest that is paid, right?
Yeah, so that's allowed by medieval law. They have something called lucrum cessans, right? I could be making money in this, but I gave money for a long-term investment. I'm currently losing money because of it. So it's okay for the guy to pay me my opportunity cost, basically, if I'm investing in his business. But I think your idea is really what the famous sociologist named Max Weber, who wrote about capitalism and the Protestant ethic. That's what his idea of capitalism is huge. He was thinking of building railroads in South America, exactly your example. And what was needed for that kind of capitalism, just huge amounts of capital.
Yes.
It's not simply making a profit, but it's the accumulation of large sums of money. And that, I think, is really becomes possible in the 17th century when they formed joint stock companies. When family economics transitions to the next stage, which is stock market economics. First stock market,
so
I believe is,
let's talk about that moment. Let's talk about how you understand what America and its founding is in this trajectory of Western civilization. So you've got the Greeks and the Romans, and you've got the emergence of the Christian European period, and then the Protestant Reformation, and now you're into the beginning of an industrial age, and you've got these colonies in North America who are here for several hundred years, or at least they're here. Yeah, I mean, if you want to say since 1492, certainly. But how do you understand? How should somebody that's trying to understand America's role in Western civilization understand what that really is? What does it mean?
Well, we are Western society. Our government, our laws, our religion, our arts, our architecture, you name it, literary traditions, everything comes out of the Greeks. Ultimately, our traditions of debate, our traditions of of um, of of well, legal traditions of all kinds. All this stuff comes out of our military traditions. Even I think to some extent come from the past. So if you want to see where America stands, you have to know the Western tradition. I will give you an example. Okay, so republicanism. We call ourselves a republic. We are aspirationally democratic, but our actual system of government is Republican. So where does that come from? Well, a republic is a virtuous democracy according to the Greeks. It's a virtuous popular government, and it is also usually a mixed constitution, meaning there are elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and populism in it. They're mixed together, and you can see that in the Constitution. So there is a republican tradition in the time of Rome. Rome is the most famous republic. Its republic fell, and that's always been a warning to Americans, as I said before. But there is a modern European republican tradition which begins with Italian city-states in the late 11th, 12th century. And then you have German city republics, you have Dutch city republics, you have the English Republic during the Commonwealth period. And the Founding Fathers read all this stuff. There are many more works of history cited in the Federalist Papers than there are political theory. I like to repeat that for my political theorist friends. They were combing the pages of history trying to figure out what they should do. And so if you understand the history of republicanism, you can see that what the Founding Fathers created was a very wise system, but it was also the most popular system that was possible in those terms. So the most popular type of republic was an aristocratic republic, where which is what the Romans had. The Senate really controlled things, and people could cause trouble for the Senate, and they had to sign off on things. But basically, policies and foreign policy was all controlled by the Senate. But what the Founding Fathers created was not like that. It wasn't like Venice. Venice was an even more aristocratic republic. The British were more popular, but nothing like America. So America very carefully put the power of the purse in the hands of the House of Representatives. So why did they do that? Because that's what the English House of Commons had. And they understood that the reason why the English House of Commons had been able to defeat the monarch is because they had the power of the purse. So everything you can read in the Constitution has a long history behind it. And you don't understand the prudence of the Founding Fathers, their wisdom, unless you see how they were using history, but also how they were inflecting it. So the House of Representatives, we have the Senate and House of Representatives. The Senate is supposed to be the wise men of the different states. Originally, it was supposed to be the wise men of the various states, senior statesmen in the individual states. And then it became a democratic election.
That's one of the many horrendous miscarriages of American reform, right up there with the income tax and prohibition.
Yeah. Well, the Electoral College was supposed to be an aristocratic institution also, and that was very quickly corrupted into by the party system. The independent judiciary is something that has a quite recent history, because most of the republics, well, that might possibly have come from the Italian republics, because the Italian republics used to bring in foreign police officers and foreign judges so that they didn't get involved in politics. So they had all this history behind them, and they were trying to pick and choose the things that would suit America and that would be appropriate to society of rough equality, which is what they had at the time. They didn't have these vast differences of wealth that we have today. So, and if you understand that, you may get a sense of the type of adjustments that we need to make in our own time. Although I always am opposed to the idea of a new constitutional Congress, because I don't know where the Jeffersons and the Adamses and the Madisons are going to come from in our modern world.
No, we'll end up with some, European Declaration of Rights type gobbledygook that gives everybody a right to a house and all kinds of nonsense, rights to other people's stuff. One of the things that is striking to me as I've been trying to revisit history to the best of my ability with limits of time. Since this is the 250th anniversary year of the Declaration of Independence, is that you have in the American Revolution, it seems like what you're describing is something sort of unbelievable in a way. You have this moment of the creation of a new nation, with a bunch of history nerds reading about what worked and what didn't, and all the direct democracies, they're always a catastrophe. We can't do that. We want to limit power. We don't want another king. How do we make sure the Leviathan of government doesn't grow? Let's separate powers. Hey, Montesquieu's got some ideas. So you've got all this stuff happening. And that's an example of putting history to use the way you've described it throughout this conversation. And then, right around the same time, you have the French Revolution. And what seems to come out of the French Revolution is tabula rasa time. Let's turn Notre Dame into the Temple of Reason, and let's rewrite the entire basic norms of the society along utopian grounds and forget history. It's year zero. And so we have in that historical moment sort of an example of what happens when you take history seriously and what happens when you pretend that you can not know your history and everything will work out great. Would you agree with that? Is that one of the, because I feel like some of the things that scare me as we sit here in 2026 is that your profession, it sounds like, have become a bunch of Jacobins.
I have a colleague who actually is a Jacobin, and proudly so.
So, it's like all of academia seems to be Jacobin. Certainly the Jacobins are running New York City, our biggest city. So that's like a different picture of where we could head if things go wrong.
Well, I think that the makers of the French Revolution actually were pretty well educated historically. But what they had and the founding fathers did not have was a deep hatred of their own country, their own system. They hated the monarch. They hated monarchy. They hated the court. They hated the control of economic system and the military system. They hated that type of aristocracy that sought glory in great deeds. They really, Americans did not hate ourselves. We didn't hate ourselves. If we hated anything, it was maybe some people in England who were trying to tax us without our permission.
I just want to use a stamp for crying out loud. Please leave me alone.
Yeah. But there was not this hatred towards the tradition. And, Rousseau, I think, is one of the key figures here because he also feeds this idea that there's something deeply wrong with our world. Right?
Yeah.
That in his famous first essay on I can't remember the name of it now, but I should know this because I've taught it many times, but it will come to me. I'm getting old. Anyway, he taught that, France is basically deeply corrupt and that we had to get back to some kind of pure system and simplify our lives, and everything had to be simple and egalitarian and straightforward and rational. And so there was this impulse towards remaking, as you point out, redoing, reconstructing, building from the ground up that wasn't really present in the U.S. The U.S. wanted to have a republic, but they wanted to have a republic that was like some republics and not like other republics. They were building something new. I'm trying to kind of search, but the thing that stands out in my mind of the French is the real hatred of the world that they inherited, especially courts and the power of kings, and the tendency, especially to ignore the educated class, because the French Revolution is a revolution of intellectuals. That's, I guess, the second thing I would point to. The U.S. Revolution was not a revolution. It was the U.S. Revolution was a revolution of educated men, and the French Revolution was a revolution of intellectuals. And that's a little bit ahistorical for me to say that, because the whole term intellectuals wasn't invented till the late 19th century. Nevertheless, they had this class of people who did nothing but read and talk and write and think and jabber in the salons.
Yeah, it's the Karl Marx types. It's the like sort of parasite class who live off Engels and then don't even say, I'm sorry about your loss when his lover dies, and then says, hey, by the way, can you give me some more? It's the trust fund kids. It's the Mamdani voters.
Yeah.
I'm not being charitable here, but I mean, the history speaks for itself on this group.
Well, a lot of these people were supported by the church. It's true that they were abbé. They had some kind of income line from the church, which allowed them to abandon their local churches and go to Paris and jabber. It's a very different sociological system than prevailed in the U.S. And the other thing, of course, is that the U.S. already had 13 states with their own constitutions or their own contracts with the British government, and they had to accommodate that, which the French never had to do, and that had a moderating effect, especially, for example, in religion, right? So the French Revolution wants to get rid of the traditional religion or transform it into the worship of the supreme being. In the U.S., you've got 13 colonies, and some are Puritan, some are Quaker, and some are Catholic, and some are Anglican, and they decided let's not have an established religion in the First Amendment. Let's let the individual states do what they want. So the effect of having these individual states' government is to give more freedom, is to require a federal government to allot more freedom at the local level. So that was a huge precondition in our favor, I think.
One of the things.
By the way, the idea of the federal government. Sorry, what?
Finish your thought, and then I have a question.
I was adding something on, but the whole idea of a federal government, which means a federation of individual states, comes out of ancient Greece. Most people don't realize that because they read Plato and Aristotle. But in the 4th century, there are many examples of Greek city-states that federated together to form a common a military resistance to outsiders, but they had individual city-state governments. So that was, I think, in the mind of the founding fathers.
I was going to say that a couple of years back, I had the privilege of interviewing Gordon Wood about the American founding, and one of the things he said was that when you look at sort of the societies of Europe at the time of the founding, you could think of it like in terms of the sort of philosophy of individual liberty, that the state is an imposition and that the individual should have as much freedom as possible to sort of act without being constrained by the state or the community, or however you want to put that. He said that basically the English were the most radical freemen of Europe for a whole host of reasons we can maybe talk about a little bit, but Magna Carta, the levelers, all kinds of stuff that gave rise to this incredible culture of freedom, and that America had developed to be like the radical of the radicals when it came to the notions of individual liberty. And you see it in the Declaration of Independence. You see it in sort of Jefferson's maybe, I think, most famous, even though it's obviously, he held slaves, so that's complicated. I don't want to minimize that by any means, but philosophically, the arguments being made in the Declaration of Independence are pretty radical at the time, right? I mean, how do you think about the radicalism of the revolution in that way. Would you agree with Gordon's assessment of the sort of lineage there?
Yes, I mean, that's the title of his book, as you know, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. And what he says is that there was a social revolution where the old hierarchical deferential powers that were operative in the New World, inherited from the Old World, were wiped out, and Americans became much more radically egalitarian. Partly that's a matter of religion, because there's no established church. There were established churches in some of the states, but most of them were done away with quickly. Both of the American and the French revolutions were against something which the ownership of power, right? The idea of privilege, that some people, because they were lords and owned property, they should exercise some kind of power. The British had a very mild form of that. The French had a very strong form of it. But so what takes over after the apparatus of British government is removed is a more radical egalitarian view. I have my problems with this. I wrote an article about this. Actually, I attended a conference in honor of Gordon Wood, and I argued that it's the ism in egalitarianism that's the problem with the radicalism, because isms mean process of change. That's the Greek suffix that means a process of change. So if you're liberalizing, you're making more liberal. If you're Hellenizing, you're making more Greek. So the idea that everything has to become more and more equal all the time, I think that's not a sustainable, I hate that word, but sustainable idea for a state, that we have to become more and more equal, that any type of merit, for example, has to be wiped out. That's the Rawlsian philosophy, that merit cannot trump the egalitarian, fundamental egalitarianism of a state. Some political theorists will jump on me for putting it that way, but that's my own crude assessment of that. But so the idea that it's like ever closer union in the European Union, that there's no end to that, right? The only end to it is absolute monarchy of some bureaucrat whose name probably we don't know. That would be ever closer union.
The perfection of democracy in this sort of post Woodrow Wilson time, the technocrats, is that the public will get some kind of vote, but the people that really matter will be PhDs making all the decisions in some distant bureaucracy.
Yeah,
it'll be like the Federal Reserve controls everything.
Yeah, ever more equality, ever more democracy. But Aristotle's right that the cure for democracy is not necessarily more democracy. It might be less democracy. And the cure for too much egalitarianism is merit. We have to balance the claims of merit, especially in politics. It's to everyone's interest to be ruled by competent, morally good, decent, well-educated people. That's what the system should aim at. That's somewhat folded into the American Constitution. But I think that one phrase that Jefferson used, that all men are created equal and now I'm going to...
Endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights.
Unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By all the thing we had to memorize in...
Yeah, I think I said inalienable.
Inalienable rights, which means rights that can't be taken away by government, right? So that is the most radical thing in all of the American founding documents, right? And it's the later Constitution dials that back slightly by creating these intermediate institutions and federalism and the courts and all that, but that is extremely radical. I think that there's very few. What really comes out of radical Protestants. This is what's been shown. Radical Protestantism of the Socinian variety, sort of Anabaptism, things like that. That's where this radical egalitarian comes from. It's kept out of politics through most of the 16th and 17th century, except in very small experimental communities, but it enters enters America as a kind of given of political life.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about, so you and I are both Catholic, Northeast Philadelphia boys, and yet we live in a country whose birth is entirely Protestant in nature, and some of these sects were particularly sort of like, oddballs, right? The Quakers, the Puritans, you've got all kinds of sort of folks who basically risked life and limb to escape the force of the Anglican and Catholic Church and go be wild and make shaker furniture and stuff. So, how important? What debt do we owe to the Protestant formation of the United States, especially you and I as Catholics, let's say, as Catholic Americans?
Yeah, well, that's very much in the news lately, of course, because of the controversy between Trump and the Pope. First of all, there's a 1,000-year-long history of discussion of church and state issues in the Western tradition, beginning with the 4th century A.D. when the Christians take over the Roman Empire. Then they have to decide who rules and what is the lay power going to be able to do, and this is an argument from the very beginning.
Well, and you can even say it goes to the Pharisees asking Christ about things, and he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. He draws this distinction right from the start, right?
The Catholic Church has a very long history of dealing with the state or with kings and republics and all forms of government, and it has had times when it, in order to survive at all, it has had to give into the power of kings and the Gallican movement in 17th century France, for example. They had to give away a lot of their powers of appointment in order to coexist with the Gallican Church. There's similar things going on in China right now. So it's not a single Catholic tradition. That's my point. And the Church has tried very hard since it was transplanted to America to be compatible with the Western and the American traditions. There were great controversies when Catholics started coming over in great numbers from Ireland and Poland, Eastern Europe, and so forth, Italy. And the Church was eventually forced to build its own educational system because in large cities with large Catholic populations, the public schools were afraid of being taken over by religious people. So, but the Church is. But if you go into the parochial schools, you'll see that they're very American. They're very patriotic, or they were up till recently. Maybe things are different now. And in any case, I think that
they're probably no less patriotic. The recent now thing would be that basically all of K through 12 education's been infected by the woke mind virus, and so you've got hating America. You can find hating America teachers in Catholic schools, private schools, public schools. If you got a degree in education, you were taught about how to hate America in all kinds of different ways. But I digress.
You digress. Well, the fact is, though, that Protestants are always going to feel more comfortable in America because it was founded by Protestants. And even though some of the Protestants were kind of were enlightened as well as being Protestant, they were liberal Protestants, in other words. The Catholics were persecuted in many cases when they came to America. I live in Somerville, Mass. My home in Massachusetts is Somerville, which has had the first anti-Catholic demonstrations in America. There was a convent founded in the east part of the city, which was attacked and burned down by anti-Catholic mobs in the 18th century. Well, I'm not sure, but it might be early 19th. I think it's still late 18th century. Okay, so Catholics don't feel as comfortable in America, and they have to think more about what church-state relations are. But I don't think that there's anything that's intrinsically un-American about Catholic teaching. The incident with the Pope recently is of is illustrative of that. As soon as the Pope decided to take sides or to appear to take sides in a political struggle in America, there was all sorts of outcry, but also among Catholics. So this is where I think Pope Leo, for all of his many merits, may have been less than prudent, lacking in some practical wisdom. I admire him in many ways, obviously, but he doesn't have to say anything. This is one of the great lessons of political prudence. Often it is the case that you don't have to say something. One of the great quotes from antiquity is, "The man who does not know how to be silent does not know how to speak." So the Pope was not saying anything different from what the Catholic hierarchy was saying in this country. He doesn't disagree with it, obviously. He didn't have to say anything, but nevertheless, he chose to say something, and he didn't have to. And so that would be my people ask me what kind of Catholic I am. I usually say bad Catholic. I try to be a good Catholic, but I feel very uncomfortable saying anything critical of the Pope, who's obviously a very good man. But I think that Catholics should be able to make themselves comfortable. There's even kind of Republican Thomism. If you want to be a Thomist, there are 10 different schools of Thomism. You can find one that is adaptable to the American government and traditions.
You took my question to an interesting place in talking about the notion of being uncomfortable as a Catholic in America. It is true. It is true that I think about how like JFK, it was a controversy that he was Catholic. It's the first Catholic president, if I'm remembering correctly. Obviously, like Joe Biden was nominally Catholic, and so that's waned. I guess what I was trying to get at is you have in America this unbelievably successful society, the richest, most powerful country on earth.
Yeah.
I think you can I think it's not unreasonable to say we are sort of the current empire, even if we're not a empire in the formal sense, but we're Team America World Police is in full effect right now. And it does seem like we owe a lot of that to the Protestant work ethic. It's hard for me not to say that that's absolutely like the sense in which it's very commonly held that Americans work like crazy, or we did, certainly compared to Europeans. That's true even today compared to Europeans, but we're like a working commercial Protestant people at the roots of it. Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
No, I don't agree with that. I think,
Okay.
Well, this goes back to Max Weber, capitalism, and the Protestant ethic.
I've never even read this. So I'm bank shot influenced by this, clearly by others. But
yeah, clearly. But this is like the fons and argo. This is the origin of this argument, and it still has its defenders. But I think the case is that the Middle Ages had a perfectly vibrant commercial society, which was already imperialistic in the 14th, 15th centuries. And, they had accommodation, the church had accommodation to various commercial enterprises and forms of exchange. I think that there's the idea that behind Weber is that you got credit, spiritual credit, for having a big pile of money because it showed that you were hardworking, right? That there was, whereas the Catholic Church teaches and always has taught, and I think this is a correct doctrine, that wealth can be illicitly acquired and illicitly spent, but it's not a virtue to have wealth, right? So there's an idea, and there are many Protestant scholars who disagree, by the way, that that these Protestant societies that Weber was pointing to coming out of the Reformation, that they really did put wealth and wealth ahead of spiritual welfare, where they did really claim that wealth was a sign of spiritual quality. That turns out to be based on very few sources. So I'm not sure I buy this idea. I'm not an expert on this subject, and I haven't read the most recent literature on it, but I have read some literature on late medieval Catholicism, which makes it quite clear that Catholic Church was happy to welcome wealthy people, and was happy that wealthy people they accorded wealthy people a high status in society. So this is very different from the Chinese, for example. Like the Chinese think that traders are the absolute bottom, the cesspool. The classes there in China, I think, are the official classes. The educated official class is the highest class, and then it's the agriculturalists, and then it's, I forget, there are 4 classes, and the tradesmen are at the bottom, right? So in Western Europe already, before the Reformation, you could be wealthy and you could be admired for your wealth. The Catholic Church created the first merchant saint at the end of the 12th century, whose name was Omo Bono of Cremona. I like that name. So Omo Bono was a wealthy man who acquired his wealth in a licit way. He didn't commit usury, and then he used his wealth to create funds so that paupers could be buried honorably with Christian burial, right? Instead of just throwing in the ditch, which is what they were doing earlier. So he was a wealthy man who was a saint already in the 12th century, and it becomes possible for people of high wealth to be accepted into the aristocracy already in Catholic times. So it was perfectly okay for a nobleman to marry a tradesman. That would be unthinkable in China. It would be unthinkable in the early Middle Ages, or even the high Middle Ages, that person who was a member of a military aristocracy or even a lawyerly aristocracy would marry a tradesperson. That would be incredibly infradig, as the British say, infra dignitatem, below their dignity, to marry someone who made their money at the trading tables, or But this is very common if you go in Europe, beginning in, I would say, maybe the late 14th, 15th, 16th century, that the lines, status lines between the nobility and the knightly classes and the wealthy classes are very blurred already in the late Middle Ages. So I guess I'm saying I don't buy the idea that Protestantism is more friendly to great wealth.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really that's a pretty interesting. This phrase, the Protestant work ethic, sort of permeates our popular culture.
Yeah,
it's an interesting thing to.
Well, that's Weber. That's the title of his book, Capitalism and the Protestant Work
I'm going to have to read that book. I'm going to have to dig into that. This is maybe a great place for us to sort of just come back to this idea of what the role of history, right? So you have ideas that permeate the culture. They come from somewhere. And unless you can actually look back and understand where they came from and why, you just can go off the rails pretty quick. So what as a parent should my viewer who's trying to grapple with educational choices, what should we do? Because it's very hard to figure out how to set up our kids to get an education that can rightly be understood to be an actual education. It's gotten quite hard. So, do you have any, you left Harvard to, after being a teacher for 40 years, and you have a vision for what history can be. We've talked about this in a lot of different ways. What's your advice to parents for trying to set up our kids to know history and put who they are and the society they're a part of in a reasonable context?
Well, I'm a great fan, as I told you, of the classical school movement. And my co-author, Alan Gelso, homeschooled all of his children precisely because he didn't want to subject them to the public school system with all of its fads and faults. I would, think it's important for students growing up to have some vision of what a good, beautiful, and the true are, right? That they would have. I think learning mathematics is very important, as Plato said, because it teaches you what certainty is, what real, certain reasoning is. I think that these schools, the classical schools, I'm very. It's the only thing in American education that makes me really happy right now, is the classical school movement. There's maybe 1 million people involved in it. There are 55 million people, kids in K-12 education in America in a year. In any given year, the public schools have been losing market share.
Yeah.
I think they're down to 48 million, but they still have the vast majority of students are still going to public school. But I think with school choice spreading everywhere, that there's a chance for American education to recover. I think parents should think about what sort of child is coming out of the educational system. What do they want their child to be like, right? Many parents seem to care only about how much money they're going to make. And that, I think, I can't really talk to a parent like that who only cares about how much money the kid makes. I think that you want a child who, first of all, will respect you and who will perhaps forgive you for any of your faults, but also might ideally admire you for your virtues. The family is tremendously important. I didn't somehow realize this growing up, how lucky I was to have good family, good parents. I had a father who was in the Navy Air Corps during the Second World War. He was a chemical engineer. He was later on rose through the ranks at an oil company, which is one reason why I'm a conservative. But he was an admiral. He was a Christian gentleman. That was his ideal, to be a Christian gentleman. And that's the first duty of a parent, I think, is to try to offer an example to children. But also get them to understand, help them to understand what good character is, what nobility of character is. Nobility is a word that we've lost, but it should be still in our vocabulary, that there are higher things in human life to which we can aspire, and there are things that should be honored. There are things for which we should be grateful. One of the things that distresses me about the sort of woke world is the total lack of gratitude. That's why I put in this book sections on gratitude to the Greeks, gratitude to the Romans, gratitude to Christendom, so people would understand where they acquired some of the basic civilized values that we still have. So I think it's important for students to grow up knowing their own history, especially American history. Even though I'm, out there ringing the bells for Western Civ, I think American history ultimately should be the more important thing. But they need to learn a balanced account of American history, not have this sort of self-hating account. They need to be very careful about teachers. And this is an old counsel that the ancient Romans used to give to parents, that you have to be careful about your teachers. They should be people of good character. Mm-hmm. You have to be careful about companions. Do you want your children to hang out with bad people? And of course, that now extends to social media. So it's a very tough thing to be a parent today, but it's something that and it's a tremendous responsibility, but also, but parents need to take it seriously. And I admire people who raise large families and take the financial, cost of that. But I think that they are, I never had any children myself because my wife was 13 years older than me when I got married in my late 20s. So that wasn't a possibility. But I admire people with large families who are willing to take that sacrifice. But it is a difficult thing. And I can't recommend classical schools. They're not all equal. I mean, some classical schools are are just starting out and may not have the resources and manpower and woman power that they need. But some of the established charter schools, like the Hillsdale schools and Great Heart schools and Thales, these are really outstanding classical schools. I think you can really get a fine education for your children, which will make them, which will give them standards of virtue and the excellent use of language and being able to communicate. A lot of skills that we were told that children had to learn are now already proving obsolete. When I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, all Harvard students were told they had to learn to code, right?
Yeah, that's not working out that great.
Computer science was the most popular major, or there was a course in computer science that was the most popular course at Harvard. So now, they have nothing left really. But people who have spent their time improving their humanity, that's what we're talking about with civilization, not just good character, but developing human abilities at a very high level. That's what virtue is excellence, right? It's excellence. All human beings are born with a range of abilities that they can cultivate, and the best educational system, the best parents are the ones that allow those abilities to reach their highest level. That should be the goal of the educational system, is to make our human capacities and even our spiritual capacities give them scope for flourishing.
One of the things when you read into history, you will encounter complaints about the young, about the corruption of the young, about the degeneracy of the upcoming generation. You see it basically in every writing you can find. There's kids these days are the worst. Our society is doomed because the young generation that's coming up is a bunch of loser degenerates that like X newfangled thing. As a historian, there's a lot to feel worried about in American culture, youth culture, Gen Z right now, around mental health, around rising support for murderous ideologies like communism that are entirely debunked by all of history on every continent. But, do you take solace in that common complaint? How do you think about worries of the young as a historian today?
Well, you're right that it's an old theme. It goes back to the Greeks. They were worried about, the Athenians were convinced that their parents were much more virtuous than they were, and the Romans always said this thing constantly. And somehow the Roman Empire went on for about 6 centuries after Sallust decided everything was going downhill in the 1st century BC.
It was a slow decline.
It's normal for older people. I'm much older than you are. I'm 71, to think about. And I do think about this, and I do believe that people in my youth were more polite, and they had learned at least a level of decency that I see fleeting, especially in public life. However, I'm an optimist, because the alternative is to be a pessimist. And I really think that America has the capacity for renewal. And I also think our Western civilization has a capacity for renewal. I'm a Renaissance scholar. The center of my interest is the Italian Renaissance. But the Italian Renaissance is only one of many Renaissances we've had in the Western tradition since antiquity. I think it's something built into Christianity and Judaism, the idea of rebirth and Renaissance. But if you go through my book, you'll see that there's a Renaissance after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. The Western Roman Latin Empire falls in 476. They start having Renaissances in the early 5th century. Right? Theodosian Renaissance and Justinianic Renaissance and Carolingian Renaissance and the Ottonian Renaissance and the 12th century Renaissance. Renaissance is us. That's what we do in the West, and I think it's possible to do that. I think even in modern times, it's possible to bring us back and restore what we were, and there's great rewards for doing that. I think Machiavelli says you never know when you're in a period of decline because it could get much worse. And getting better is totally unpredictable. So I don't really know if we're in a period of decline, and the Renaissance is, the green shoots are starting to shoot up. But I have hope for that. I think it's something that our civilization is capable of doing, and especially in America, where we are such an optimistic people and such an energetic people. Despite the efforts to destroy the will and the spirit of the American people, I think it's still there, and we'll be coming around.
I ask this question of every guest on their first appearance on this show. The show's called Dad Saves America because I'm a dad, and because I think that role of father is one that, I strongly recommend. I think it has this outward effect, starting with the family, but rippling out to the whole society. How do you think about your role in the American story?
My personal role? Well, I have, in the earlier part of my life, I was very much inspired by the ideal of scholarship. And I loved doing scholarship. I used to travel around with my wife in Italy, going from small town to small town, knocking on the doors of monasteries, trying to find new documents and reading manuscripts. I enjoyed that tremendously, and I thought I was serving a worthy enterprise, one that would ultimately help our civilization to stay alive. But now I've decided I need a more active role. So I wrote this book with my friend Alan, which took a long time, took 4 years, but in effect, I've been writing it my entire life. While I was writing it, I had this sense, very strong sense, that this is what I should be doing, that this is something I can help with. And that's really what I'm dedicated to doing down here in the Hamilton School, is to try to revive the study of Western Civ. Alan and I are going to start an MA program. We got the go-ahead on that, which will be professional formation for classical school teachers in Western tradition. So at least until I'm struck down by the gods for hubris, which may happen at any moment, I'm going to work on that project.
Well, I think that is indeed, in a time where nobility is not on every tongue, that is a noble project. And James Hankins, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. This has been an intellectual romp together. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much for talking to you.